So in chapter 1 of Luke's Gospel, we hear a promise of all that's going to happen when the Messiah comes. And one of the end parts of that promise says that when Jesus comes, he would guide our feet into the way of peace. That's the very beginning of Luke's Gospel. Right at the very end of Luke's Gospel, the resurrected Christ comes to his disciples, and as they're chatting amongst themselves, he appears to them and says, "Peace be with you." So in this literary framework, in this the Gospel of Luke, we have the very beginning and the very end, both Jesus talking about leading us into peace. So how are we to understand this morning's passage when he says, "I come to bring fire to this earth, and division, not peace"? How can the one who tells a story about the kingdom of heaven, being like a father who is reconciled to an estranged son, be the same one who sets parents against children and children against parents? Didn't Jesus bless with peace those whom he healed? Didn't he teach his followers, the disciples, to go out and bless with peace the towns and the homes and the villages that they visited as they shared the good news with them? So in the light of Jesus' own preaching, his own work, his own testimony, what can this passage of division possibly mean? As Anne suggested, there are probably many preachers coming up to this Sunday's reading who would have looked at the passage and gone, "Ugh," and possibly chosen to preach on the psalm or one of the other passages today. It's not an easy passage. Even the theologians down through the centuries have argued fiercely over what this is all talking about. Some have seen that there's a justification for a just war, if you like. When it talks about nations being set against nations, or we see that reality, they see almost the acceptance of that in this passage. Some see the reasons for division between family members, between the believers and the non-believers in this passage, when those are confronted by the light of the gospel. Some have suggested that it's metaphorical. It's talking about those times when our mind is trying to wrestle with our sinful passions. Well, those are all possible and good. But it's not just the central theme of this passage that is hard to pin down. Even this image of fire has been a little tricky. You remember only a few weeks ago we had a story about James and John when they were with Jesus and they were rejected from entering some of the towns. They said, "Well, should we call down fire on these villages?" And Jesus rebuked them for thinking that way. And now Jesus says, "I come to bring fire." You can almost hear James and John in the background going, "Well, how come we weren't allowed to if you're allowed to?" There's a big difference between the fire that cleanses and a fire that incinerates. James and John were thinking about a fire that would incinerate opposition and rejection. Jesus, however, is not talking about that kind of fire. He's talking about a fire that cleanses, a fire that he's actually bringing through and into himself, through his baptism, as he calls it. And there's a gift that he is bringing to this world in bringing the kingdom, but it's a self-giving that requires self-sacrifice, not the sacrificing of others. So the fire that Jesus is talking about is radically different from those other images that James and John had in their minds. So what I'm doing this morning is deliberately interpreting this one story, this one passage, in the light of, hopefully, the totality of Luke's Gospel and all the stories that Luke wants to tell us about Jesus. So in many of the commentaries, I don't know if you found, Anne, they talk about this pericope, which is a great word, and I thought I'd explain what it means, because it was explained to me that each story, or pericope, is like a string of pearls, and the stories are the individual pearls, right? But on a string of pearls, there's a relationship between maybe the big one in the centre and all the ones that lead up to it. And you can, in fact, look at a really lovely string of pearls, means that, or well, you would presume that each one is actually balancing the others. You don't have them, the little ones on the outside have to sort of be in sync with the other ones. Even though they're ones at the start and ones at the end, they all lead to the one in the middle. And so we have in the Gospel something like that at work. We have individual stories that you could take apart and look at that one story. But the larger context is that they are on this string of stories, and there's a coherent theme that runs through them. So we can see a theme of Jesus bringing peace, Jesus bringing light into the world. But there are times when that peace and when that light brings and forms separation and contrast, and sometimes division. So this passage becomes descriptive rather than prescriptive. That is, Jesus is talking about what actually happens when light comes into a dark place, rather than what ought to happen in relationships and in families. When the kingdom comes, there are reversals within relationships, within lives. When the kingdom comes, there is this wonderful transformation of what used to be. What Jesus is saying is that his purpose is not to divide parents from their children and put children against their parents, but sometimes that's what happens when Christ's work is done, when the kingdom actually comes. Just like in the prodigal son that we have in Luke's Gospel, where the father is reconciled to the son that was estranged for a number of years. That was God's work. That was God's kingdom coming to the father and the son. But what we see is that the second son is estranged because God's kingdom has come near. And we see that he estranges himself. He removes himself from the party. That is the result of God's kingdom coming, of God's grace coming to that family. He removes himself from it. So in essence, this passage that we have today is Jesus talking about that at work, that dynamic happening in different ways. When the kingdom comes, there are these reversals. And the question for us is, do we do the same as that second son? Are we so happy with the status quo that when the kingdom comes and reverses things, when God breaks into our world, do we get upset? Do we become concerned that God's graciousness is given so lavishly, maybe to someone that we felt was undeserving of God's grace? In one of the commentaries I read, the commentator made the comment, or perhaps it's a cliche even, no one expects to see their enemies in heaven. I think there's probably a truth to that. We can go through life assuming that, God's graciousness is abundant and his forgiveness is, sure, and we think, well, that means we're going to heaven. But then we have this notion, well, but our enemies surely won't be getting grace and forgiveness and, I think it's sort of a tongue-in-cheek thing, but there can be a reality to our own hearts that assume we've been given this wonderful grace so lavishly, but we're not so confident on behalf of those people around us that we find really hard to get along with. Any ministry that reconciles long-standing enemies is going to tear other relationships, the ones that depend on the status quo. So I feel that there's a challenge and a warning in this passage for us that we should not be like that. We should not be like that second son who decides that the party is going on, God's reversal has taken place right there in his own family, in his midst, that God is changing lives, but somehow he feels that he can't be a part of it. The truth is that jealousy or anger or desire for revenge or resistance to change, those things, if they take hold in us, if they grow in us, they can consume us to the point that when we see the gospel at work, we remove ourselves. We take ourselves outside the party and feel that it's somehow not for us. But how do we not be resistant to change? How are we not going to be resistant when God's kingdom comes and overturns something? How would we even want to be involved in that kind of a transformation in the lives of maybe our enemies or maybe just someone that we don't like? How would we take up that opportunity to be involved in God's graciousness? And I thought to myself, the only way is if we can allow God to work in us. If we can allow that God has work to do in us, that we have our shadow sides. We don't want them to be the place that we make our decisions out of or act out of, but we know they're there. And we can ask God to work in us, to remodel our hearts to reflect his own, that he might reform our passion. In this passage we see very much a glimpse of Jesus' passion for the kingdom. He says, how I'm anxious to see this fire started. We don't use language like that very often. But if you get us talking about those areas that we're passionate, whether it's the Eagles or whether it's whatever, if you get us talking about our passions, and in this we see an opportunity that our passions might be aligned with God's, that we might be passionate people, but passionate for his kingdom, passionate for his reversals, for his reconciliation in the world. And then that got me thinking, where do we see that reconciliation taking place? It's all sorts of big and small ways. But I remember a few years ago, I was asked to do a wedding for a couple that weren't really involved in the church, but had some links and somehow came across myself and asked if I'd do the wedding. And it was in a little local chapel, so not in one of the churches, but in this chapel. And it was wonderful because in that little opportunity, there was a girl who had been going to the Anglican church as a young girl, came along to that wedding and was so taken up with the presence of God that she came to me afterwards and said, I really want to get back into church. It's reminded me, coming here, that I've been missing something. And she came to our church for a little while and then realised, well, my roots are in the Anglican church. And so she connected with her Anglican church that was next door to us. But it was wonderful to see this transformation, this reconciliation of a daughter of God who was estranged and this person's life just break open into joy and beauty, and all sorts of goodness came into her life because she was reconciled with Christ, reconciled to God, her Creator. There's nothing more exciting than being around that kind of reconciliation process. And if we can open ourselves up to just looking for it, just participating wherever it might be possible, where there are those opportunities, that kind of God's kingdom coming will excite us and direct us. Direct our feet into God's peace. Let's pray. Loving Lord God, we thank you that Christ did come. That his light, bright though it is a light that is beautiful. Lord God, draw us deeper into your presence. Draw us deeper into your grace. Draw us deeper into your passionate fire that burns away the unnecessary things of our hearts and our minds and our lives, that we might be freed, that we might be cleansed, that we might be joyful and passionate for the things of your kingdom. Lord God, do your work in us. Refine our hearts. Refine our lives. We pray.